This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news podcast from BBC Radio 4.
BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Diana Speed. Good evening. The government has set out its plans for new laws on a post-Brexit relationship with the EU, tougher prison sentences and cutting pollution. But opposition parties have dismissed the bills in the Queen's speech as fool's gold and a propaganda exercise. Thousands of people have taken to the streets in Barcelona to protest against jail sentences given to 9 Catalan separatist leaders for their roles in an independence referendum 2 years ago. Syrian government troops, who are backed by Russia, have moved close to the border with Turkey to help Kurdish fighters being attacked by Turkish forces. A notorious paedophile who was jailed for abusing as many as 200 children has been found stabbed to death in his prison cell. The former England football star Paul Gascoigne has gone on trial for sexual assault on a woman on a train. Boris Johnson has said the government's new legislative programme offers a vision for a just and fair society. The main focus will be on measures to crack down on crime and legislation related to Brexit. 22 new bills were outlined in the first Queen's speech since Mr Johnson became Prime Minister. They included plans for a new immigration system and setting legally binding targets to reduce the use of plastics and cut pollution. Jeremy Corbyn dismissed the proposals as a propaganda exercise, saying the government knew it could not deliver them. Our assistant political editor Norman Smith watched the day's events.
Despite the traditional pageantry, today's Queen's speech may prove one of the most unusual and even superfluous of modern times, unless the Prime Minister can win a general election. Devoid of a Commons majority and having lost every significant vote he's held in the Commons, there seems little prospect of Mr Johnson being able to pass any major legislation in the current Parliament. Despite that, the Prime Minister today chose to set out a busy legislative programme dominated by bills on Brexit and law and order. Among the Brexit measures, proposals for an independent fisheries policy, a trade bill paving the way for an independent trade policy, and the introduction of a points-based immigration system to replace freedom of movement. On crime, there'll be longer sentences for those convicted of serious violent offences and tougher punishments for foreign offenders. On social care, there was a promise of fresh proposals but no details, and there was no legislation to protect veterans facing historic allegations of wrongdoing. In the Commons, Mr Johnson told MPs the Queen's speech was underpinned by One Nation conservative values.
That is the vision for the society I believe in. A generous, tolerant, outward-looking and humane society. That is the vision at the core of this Queen's speech, and I commend it to the House.
The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn dismissed the measures in the Queen's speech as fool's gold. They should not disguise, he said, from the government's failure to deliver on Brexit or to end austerity. It was, said Mr Corbyn, a propaganda exercise.
There has never been such a farce as a government with a majority of minus 45 and a 100% record of defeat in the House of Commons, setting out a legislative agenda they know cannot be delivered in this Parliament.
The SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford condemned the Queen's speech as a Tory election manifesto, and he urged Mr Corbyn and the Lib Dem leader Jo Swinson to back a no-confidence vote to topple a dangerous and untrustworthy Prime Minister.
Only by taking control of the House this week can we bring down and end the days of this government. That is the only way that we can assure that we can secure an extension and make sure that no deal can not become a reality. We cannot wait and trust the Prime Minister and his cronies in Number 10.
The hope in Downing Street is that today's Queen's speech will appeal to voters weary of the endless Brexit delay and anxious to move on to other pressing domestic issues. The danger that a further Brexit extension becomes necessary, making the measures in this Queen's speech even less likely to ever be introduced.
The Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney has said it's still possible that a Brexit deal could be reached this week. He said technical discussions were continuing about Boris Johnson's latest plan to break the deadlock, but he acknowledged that the task would not be easy. Downing Street described the talks as constructive, but said there was still a long way to go. Our Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly reports from Brussels.
With a summit of EU leaders scheduled for Thursday, 2 days now remain to find a solution to the problems of the Irish border, which has proved elusive for 3 years. Boris Johnson and his Irish counterpart Leo Varadkar said last week that they could see a pathway to a deal, not that the pathway was short nor the going easy. As he arrived in Luxembourg for an EU meeting, Ireland's Foreign Minister Simon Coveney stressed that a deal was still possible, but far from certain.
We've spent 3 years trying to get an agreement between the two sides that have made progress at different times, but certainly the last number of months have been difficult. So I think, as my Taoiseach has said, a deal is possible, and it's possible this month, may even be possible this week, but we're not there yet. And as Michel Barnier said yesterday, there's still a lot of work to do.
Officials involved in the technical talks in Brussels are avoiding offering leaks or briefings about exactly what's going on. Opinions differ as to whether this really amounts to tunnel negotiations, the Brussels jargon for intense, focused talks entered into when a deal is in sight. It makes it hard to evaluate what progress is being made, and the only on-the-record word so far has come from the EU's negotiator Michel Barnier, who said a lot of work remained to be done, without saying whether he thought it was doable.
Thousands of protesters took to the streets of Barcelona today and blocked the city's airport after a group of high-profile Catalan separatists were handed lengthy jail sentences for their part in a failed independence bid in 2017. The 9 politicians and activists were given prison terms of between 9 and 13 years. The former Vice President of Catalonia, Oriol Junqueras, who received the longest sentence, vowed to fight forever for independence and said they'd been jailed for their political ideals. The Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, denied that and said nobody was above the law. Our Europe correspondent, Damien Grammaticus, joined protesters at the airport.
This is Barcelona Airport Terminal